AI is everywhere in modern life, not just the showy and spectacular generative AI that can write essays and create fake photographs, but the kind of AI that's embedded in social media algorithms, streaming service recommendations, smart devices like step counters and smartwatches, and home assistants like Siri, Alexa, and Google Assistant, even things like smart thermostats, home security systems, and car navigation systems. All of these systems need data about you in order to function effectively for you. But because of this, they're also able to use the data that they gather from you to profit in other ways. Now, the mere fact that a corporation is able to extract profits from its interactions with you in ways that you don't control isn't always a problem. But the point of this lecture is to help you think through the ways that the corporation's interests and your interests may be aligned and may be at odds or may be completely orthogonal to each other, so that you can be a bit more conscious of when you want them to have your data, when you don't want them to have your data, and how much effort it's worth putting into controlling this data flow. I won't talk too much about the details of very specific technologies here. If I did, this video would likely be obsolete in just a few weeks. Instead, I will focus on the ways that you can better think about whatever the situation is that you face. Okay, so why control your data? Well, if you are a rich or powerful or important person, or if you're engaged in activity that is legally banned by the country you live in, some cases will be obvious. Thieves or prosecutors or your political opponents might want your data to expose you or to extort you or to rob you. But why should an ordinary person with no illegal activity care? Well, first, I'm not sure I fully believe you if you claim that you have no illegal activity. But let's assume that you're already being careful with the illegal activity that you do engage in. Why be careful with the rest of your data? Well, you may have some legal or moral obligation to keep some data secret. This probably doesn't apply too much to most people who don't have a security clearance or signed a non-disclosure agreement, but it might if you're in charge of employees or students or anyone else like that. More importantly, there's the question of potential privacy or embarrassment. You might think you have nothing to hide, but there's probably some things that you do want to have some control of. Think about how you feel if your parents are flipping through the photos on your phone, or how you would feel if your professor was looking through the history of the text messages that you've sent, or if your boyfriend saw the history of purchases that you've made at bars and underwear stores from the year before you met. Any of this sort of thing could happen depending on how your data gets shared. And for instance, your Maps app might highlight businesses that it thinks are of interest to you on the basis of data gathered from your other apps. And if that includes your dating apps or other things like that, there's a possibility for leakage of this sort of information that you might want some amount of control over. Now, the last point is that even if you don't mind whether your information is being used by a company, this information is valuable to them. And if you intentionally control the flow of this information, it's possible that you may be able to extract payment or a better service from some companies rather than just giving away all the data for free. So that's something to think about and look into. Is there any way for you to profit off the data rather than someone else? There may not be, but it's worth thinking about. Okay, so now here are some of the broad areas to think about with regards to data security. Whose data are we talking about? Is it yours, someone else's, or general people that you know? How is the data being used? And how is the data being gathered? Okay, so one of the first things to think about with any data gathering service is whose data is being gathered. The easiest case is when it's your data, which is probably what you're mostly thinking of. And now there's some other cases that are easy to think about where you're using the service to interact with a group that you have responsibility for. So for instance, if you're assigning the students in your class to use a certain kind of app, or choosing some software for your employees, or if you're involved with a religious organization and have parishioners who are relying on you or interacting with you, or if you're a political activist who's organizing volunteers, maybe protesters, or if you're just someone who runs a band and wants to share your band's music, or if you are writing a publication and have various other writers who are sharing their stories with you, or if you're creating an art show. In all of these cases, if you're running some sort of group, then you should consider whether any of those people might have sensitive data that shouldn't be shared with whatever service it is that you're using. And which services have what things to worry about, that's to think about more later on. Now, there is a case that's harder to think about. All the people that you are somewhat attached to. Even if your friend or family member doesn't have a smartphone or has turned off the location tracking on their smartphone, a service might have reasonable guesses about their location on the basis of your location. Uh, Even if someone's phone is off, if you send a text message to that number, you are generating data about being their contact. And for instance, the US government tracks that to figure out who might be involved with terrorism. And in 2018, during congressional hearings, it became clear that Facebook was also tracking this sort of information, and it was using it to create shadow profiles of people who had never signed up for Facebook. And some of this was used for better targeting ads on non-Facebook sites, but some of it was also to help suggest friend connections between people if both of them had texted the same person who was non-Facebook user. For most people, this probably isn't relevant, but if you do interact often with anyone who might have elevated concerns about their privacy, you should think about this. And if you are someone who has special concerns about your data privacy, you should talk to your friends and family and any of your other contacts about taking special precautions before they call or message you or spend time around you. Probably not relevant for most people, but something to have in the back of your head. Now let's think about how the data is used. Some data is essential for the service. Your Maps program can give you some maps even without you allowing it to know your location, but it's not going to be able to give you directions to get home unless you give it location privileges. A large language model can't do what you want unless you tell it what you want. And your fitness tracker just isn't going to be useful unless it has access to your heart rate and location and motion and so on. In most of these cases where the app is using the data in an essential way, you probably have already considered whether or not you are fine with the company having this data and the ability to sell it for profit. But once in a while, especially when signing up for new services or thinking about removing old apps from your phone, you should consider whether the benefit of the service really is worth the access to the data that you're giving it. Now, I do want to talk a bit more about data being stolen or legally coerced. You might trust the company that's gathering your data and trust them not to intentionally share it with anyone who might cause you problems. But data sharing doesn't always happen intentionally. It's often worth having some sense of whether criminals or governments might be able to force access to your data. There have been hacks of the servers of many major companies, particularly things like insurance companies and banks that have large amounts of data that is very valuable for financial criminals. Now, big companies usually have high precautions around stealing of their data. So you might want to be more careful about what data you're sharing with a company that you've never heard of than for a really big company that you might trust to have some amount of security precautions. Of course, big banks have had data stolen, but their data is extremely valuable. Uh, from companies like Google, Apple, Microsoft, and Amazon, there have also been some amount of data theft, but that's often from users who weren't as careful about using the full security precautions that these big companies provide. Now, one thing that's worth remembering is that criminals aren't the only ones who can steal your data. Governments can often order your data to be released, especially if there's some compelling allegation that it's relevant to a criminal investigation. Now, every country has different standards of which crimes or national security considerations might compel the release of what data, and what sort of warrant might be needed from a court to prove the relevance of the data before it's released. Now, I can't go into all the details of all of international law, but in general, if your data is stored in Europe, there's going to be a high level of protection of your privacy, and governments can only compel the release of the absolutely necessary amount of data, if any. While in China, there's in fact already broad government use of surveillance and many other data gathering techniques, and even minor crimes can be used to warrant the release of large amounts of data. India and the United States are somewhat more chaotic and complex. The systems are constantly changing, that they vary from location to location and based on type of data. From some other countries, the EU has determined that South Korea and Japan's data protection is almost as strong as theirs, and so they are willing to vouch for their data security, though they might not be quite as explicitly strict as Europe is. Taiwan is also relatively strict about security, though not quite as much as South Korea or Japan. I'm not going to pretend to know anything about the security of data that is stored in other parts of Asia, Africa, or Latin America. But if you're signing up for a new service or traveling to a new country that might motivate you to sign up for that service, you might want to check the rules about data sharing in the country you're going to, or that the service is based in. Now, one further thing to note, even if you aren't personally worried about your own data being released for a legal proceeding in one of these countries, you might not be committing any crimes. You might not think that your data is of interest to the government. There might still be reason to worry about potential intergovernmental conflict between countries. And for this reason, China bans the use of many US-based internet services because they don't want data of their citizens being stored outside the country. South Korea bans all use of mapping services that store data outside South Korea. So you can't really use Google Maps in South Korea. You have to use a Korean app for mapping there. India bans the use of all apps that store their user data in China, including TikTok, and the US and EU are considering similar bans. As I record this video in August 24, there is a bill that has passed the US Congress and been signed into law by the president that gives TikTok and similar apps 12 months to either sell themselves to entities outside of China and keep their data outside of China, or else cease operating in the United States. It remains to be seen whether this law will go into effect, but because it concerns the data of hundreds of millions of users and not just any individual, this is why governments may care about this sort of thing. Now, one other thing to keep in mind regarding data privacy and security is that apps can get data about you in several ways. Some of it is through your direct use of the app, which might include some information that is incidental to the primary use of the app, but could still be valuable to third parties. So maybe your fitness tracker doesn't care about how your heart rate relates to your location, but maybe there's an advertiser who would really like to know if people's heart rates are going up when they walk past a certain store. Maybe your dating app doesn't care about the details of what you say in messages, but maybe there's someone out there who's generating a large language model or a translation app for romantic or sexual purposes who wants training data from users of dating apps. Now, some of these things, in some cases, you are explicitly uploading data to a service. And hopefully in that case, you've thought about whether or not it's worthwhile. But if you have access to lists of customers at work or lists of students at school, you should not upload that to large language models to sort through unless you are very certain about the data security protections that are involved. Maybe the more surprising feature, though, is third-party sharing, where one app gets permission to access data generated by other apps on your same device. And this is one of the things that the big tech companies like Apple, Google, Meta, Amazon, and Microsoft have so much data about, because they offer their authentication services as sign-ins for third-party apps. But then if you're signing in through this service on another app, then that means that one of those services is able to get the data that you're generating in the other app. Sometimes they can do it also by accessing the cookies on your device. Now, one final thought about all this. Data in all its forms is what enables AI systems to produce the products that are more effective at what they do. They can show you the music or movies that you like. They can sell you the products that you want. And they can generate text that sounds like you or that does what you're trying to do. They can better identify you to enable security and to identify the things that you want. Much of this is entirely good. There's a reason that we want these services and why they've become so widespread, and we're even willing to pay for many of them. Although our social media feeds and our video and music feeds are more individualized and distinct than they were a decade or two ago, they often provide us with more of the music and video and other content that we personally want to engage with. But sometimes these services are optimized for engagement, not in ways that satisfy our authentic desires, but in ways that inflame our outrage or otherwise enhance our negative emotions and keep us coming back. It could be that our music and video feeds have not learned how to cater to our unique tastes, but instead have learned how to shape our tastes into the ones that it's easy to cater to. We might wonder whether all this algorithmic data usage is enhancing our individual authenticity by providing us with the things that we personally want, or perhaps repressing our authenticity by shaping us into the kinds of people that these services know how to engage with. The companies and services involved don't care which it is. They just care about profiting either way. We are the ones who want to consider, is there really a difference here? Is our authenticity a real thing that matters? If you like the videos that you're served, maybe it doesn't matter whether they're the videos that you authentically wanted to watch or whether these are the desires that the company gave you. But at least sometimes, and perhaps more so with the more advanced AI techniques, they've found ways to keep us engaged that don't particularly make us happy. People sometimes call this kind of content slop, that just engages your attention and keeps you coming back, but it's sort of like a lukewarm hot tub where you don't want to get out, but it's not exactly getting you what you wanted. It may be worth thinking more about all of this as you continue to engage with all these services and decide how and when it's worth controlling your data.